I apologize for giving the talk in English. I've been practicing for the last 3 years with my Russian, but it's still very poor. But if Olia is around, I think she might translate. No? No. Okay. It's okay. But if there are particular things or particular words or whatever which don't make sense, please just put up your hand and I'll try and explain it. But I'll also try and speak clearly and slowly so that it makes sense. Right. Okay. It's going to be a very provocative talk, designed to annoy you. Because these are some of, this is my starting point. I thought about putting assumptions, but they're probably more like prejudices. So first of all, I'm going to argue that the way to think about perception is that the world provides rich information. And that contrasts, I think, with some of the classical views, Helmholtz's view, and indeed the views of Richard Gregory and Irvin Rock, who always thought about the information from the world as being impoverished, very little information, whereas I want to argue that actually there's rich information out there. And as a consequence, I think there's probably no need to invoke ideas of hypotheses, representations, higher level processes with respect to perceptual processes. More importantly, it seems to me it's obvious that the reason why we've evolved perceptual systems is to guide our behavior and action. If our perceptual systems would have never evolved in their own right unless they actually helped us to survive, which means, of course, to act in the world. But it's interesting, isn't it, that in perception, nearly all of the experimental work is all about appearance, what things look like, rather than about the link between perception and the behavior that is actually mediated. And I put in a question, which is, why do we have these subjective experiences? It's very nice looking out at all of you in the audience there. I have that qualia, that subjective experience. But if you think about it, subjective experiences are not necessary in order for you to have a perceptual system which guides your action. And the best evidence from that, of course, comes from robotic systems and indeed perhaps from the perceptual systems of animals lower down the phylogenetic scale, who we assume don't have qualia. We don't think flies, when they're flying around, have a nice qualia of this desk and decide whether to land on it. They merely use visual information to guide action. So I find it a very interesting question as to why we actually have those subjective experiences. Clearly, it's a profound question and one that I don't think we have an answer to at the moment. They must be functionally very useful, but nevertheless, if you think about perception in this way, exactly why are they necessary? And the consequence of that is we need to understand perception in terms of evolutionary processes and indeed think more about the perceptual systems of lower species, of lower level species. I often talk to my students about the fact that we have a very chauvinist view about our perceptual system and think of it as being very different from the perceptual systems of animals. Whereas, in fact, I'm fairly confident that most of the basic underlying mechanisms and the way in which animals use perceptual information, not just visual information, of course, bears a lot of similarity to the way we use it, and therefore we can gain insights from looking at the perceptual systems of lower-level species. And I'm going to say there are dangers in using words. I'm sorry, I should have put in translations of things like assumptions, inferences, choosing hypotheses when we're referring to the properties of what I would like to call an attuned perceptual system. It seems to me that it's very easy. We have lots of metaphors, at least in English. I see what you mean. And it sort of implies that our perceptual systems are somehow related very much to higher level processes. It seems to me that actually most of the way in which we use perceptual systems, we don't need to use these sorts of words. So those are my prejudices. Okay, so my outline is to talk a little bit about the concept of illusion, and then if we have time, I'll say something about traditional classifications of illusions and possible alternative ways of thinking about perceptual phenomena. And the bottom line, so you can all go to sleep now, is that from my point of view, there is no meaningful distinction between the things that we call illusions and the things that we call correct or veridical perception. There is no meaningful divided line. Someone's agreeing already. It's very interesting when I have given this talk in the past, people either say, that's obvious, of course we agree with you, or they violently disagree with you. So I don't know whether that'll turn out this morning. Okay, so the starting point, what is an illusion? Well, what I've done is to use various people's descriptions, and let me take three. One by a good friend of mine, Barbara Gillam in Australia. The term illusion refers to a discrepancy between perceived reality and objective or physical reality. Nick Wade adds the qualifier that illusions require a yardstick or reference relative to which the illusion can be assessed. And my former tutor, of course, and good friend, the late Richard Gregory, defined illusions as departures from reality. And of course, the key idea behind this is that we've got this thing called our perceptions. And in general, I think we all may agree on what we perceive. We agree on the colors, the forms, and so on. The disagreement, it seems to me, comes from the other side of the equation, if you like, which is how we define this thing called reality. So, what is the appropriate description of the objective or physical reality, or the appropriate reference? Because that's what we're using to judge whether something is an illusion or not, whether there's a deviation, a departure between this description of reality and what actually we perceive. And it seems to me the basic problem is there are many different objective realities. There's not just one. And I'll go through very quickly how we can make that point. For example, you might think that the retinal size, the retinal shape, the retinal intensity, the retinal wavelength, the retinal orientation might be the right starting point for judging whether we have an illusion. But clearly, if that were true, then all the constancies would be illusions. For example, if you take one of these light fittings, then clearly the image on your retina depends on where you're sitting. If you're sitting right underneath, it's more or less square. If you're standing from where I am, it's some funny compressed trapezoidal shape. Now, if you ask me the question, what shape are those light fittings? Of course, I would say rectangular, or square rather. There's absolutely no doubt at all, okay? Despite the fact that the input, the objective reality of the image on the retina is trapezoidal, at least for me. But the fact that we have what we call some sort of orientation constancy, which means that we take account of the orientation of the surface, means that the actual retinal orientation isn't the correct starting point. And actually, it's interesting. I'll just as an aside, many of you, I'm sure, have read some of James Gibson's books on ecological psychology. He's a lovely, provocative writer, and perhaps I like to be in that family. And at one point in his book, he says, the retinal image is irrelevant for perception. And when my students read that, they go, has this chap gone absolutely mad? Because how can you get away with not having a retinal image? But his meaning, of course, was the retinal image is not the correct starting point for trying to assess our perceptions, to try and judge our perceptions. And it's interesting, as I say, Richard Gregory was my supervisor, but in the first page of his book, Eye and Brain, he makes this comment that we are given tiny, distorted, upside-down images in the eyes. Now, in other words, he's assuming that that's the right way of describing the input to the visual system. We have tiny images, we have distorted images, they're even upside down, which of course are all non-problems. That's not the right starting point. And that's why, obviously, the retinal size, even though it's objective and it's a reality, is not the right way to assess whether we have illusions or not. So, what's better than that? Well, you could say it's what's out there. Because then, of course, these square light fittings they are actually square light fittings, and I perceive them to be a square light fitting, so you wouldn't regard that as an illusion. And likewise with other constancies, size constancy, the fact that I see a face at the back of the room as being the same size as a face at the front of the room is not an illusion, because well, in reality they are the same size. I perceive them to be roughly the same size. So that sounds much better. What is out there is the reality as the reference for judging whether we have an illusion or not. But it can be problematic. And some of you may have heard this already, but one of the famous examples, which we continually use and give to our students, and is all the textbook, is the famous Ames room. Here's the picture. I love this picture because it's nice and old, and it's from Richard Gregory's book back in 1966. And all of you will know that the Ames room, that's the view of it on the left-hand side, and that's the actual plan view showing that the room is actually trapezoidal, which means, of course, that the person who's in the far corner there is actually further away than this point, and therefore, of course, looking from a particular vantage point, a particular peephole, the angular size of that person is much smaller than there. And this is, well, we call it the Ames room, we call it an illusion, but actually what Richard Gregory wrote very sensibly back in 1966 is it must look like a normal room if constructed according to strict perspective and viewed from the right position, because the image it creates is the same as for an ordinary room. So if you think about it, actually the Ames room tells us nothing, because if it's properly constructed, and if you don't construct it properly, you don't get the effect. But if it's properly constructed with all the right sort of painting on the wall, because of course that wall at the back there is actually slanting away from you, so you have to make the shapes on the wall get larger and so on and so forth, in order to make the retinal image absolutely identical to that which would be created by a normal room. So a moment's thought tells you that no seeing machine, it's not just humans or biological systems, no seeing machine could possibly tell the difference between an Ames room and a true rectangular room. So from that point of view, it seems to me it's totally and utterly trivial. The right question to ask, it seems to me, is why rectangular rooms look rectangular. It's not why the Ames room doesn't look trapezoidal, because there's nothing to tell you it's trapezoidal. It's got all the patterns of light and dark that would be produced by a rectangular room. So why do we see rectangular rooms as rectangular? Well, the answer, of course, is there's lots of information. Perspective information, which is telling you that these walls are parallel and so on and so forth. So rather than thinking about the Ames room as a rather impoverished situation, which is how the textbooks tend to describe it, it's actually very rich in information. And if it didn't have that richness, we wouldn't actually perceive it as being a rectangular room. And just to make the point, this is our own Ames room, and I usually make the joke that I spent years generating this huge Ames room with all the detail absolutely correct, and then I found two twins who I put in either corner, the far corner of the room and the close corner of the room. Of course, I did nothing of the sort. This is a normal rectangular room, and what I did using Photoshop is to superimpose two images on it. Now, and that's why I put down, this is not an Ames room. You know René Magritte's famous, this is not a pipe, or this is not an Ames room. But this makes the point, and I want to argue, that the Ames room, or any other situation which creates exactly the same pattern of light, we can call it the optic array, as a real-world scene, is not an illusion. There are the two cases, if you like, alongside each other, and it tells us nothing that we didn't know or couldn't find out from looking at the real-world scenario that it mimics. So Ames rooms, sadly, it seems to me, are totally and utterly trivial. It's not limited to the Ames room. If we assume that illusions are judged on the basis of what is out there does not correspond to it. That's what makes you think that the Ames room is an illusion, because what is out there is a trapezoidal room, okay? But if you think about it, all these things, the Ames room, viewing stereoscopic images, structure for motion, Adelson's checker shadow illusion, Sugihara's defying gravity illusion, actually none of them should be classified as illusions because they all mimic some other situation. Let me just go through them very briefly. This is a good old-fashioned stereoscope. It's a Wheatstone stereoscope from the 1830s. And of course, what you do is put two flat pictures, and they're viewed via those two mirrors to the two eyes. And what you actually see is some object standing out in depth. Now, when I ask my students, is this an illusion? They say, yes, it is, because the pictures are actually flat. But the key, of course, is that the two different pictures presented to the two eyes create exactly the same patterns of light, exactly the same optical rays as would a 3D shape. So from that point of view, there is no illusion at all. It is just mimicking. I use the word facsimile. It's a copy of what would be produced by some real-world situation, and therefore it is not an illusion. Secondly, viewing structure for motion. This is our own work on motion parallax. I won't dwell on that. This is a nice one. We all love this one, don't we? And present it to students. This is Ted Adelson's checker shadow illusion. And why it's regarded as an illusion is that if you're asked to judge the lightness of those two squares, A and B, you'll say, that's the dark square, that's the light square. And then the trick, I haven't done it here, is to present the same slide with a mask over everything apart from the little areas, and you can see that they actually reflect back to your eye exactly the same amount of light. And we say, oh my gosh, this is an illusion. We actually see a black and a white square, whereas the amount of light coming from them is exactly the same. We can dismiss this, it seems to me, for two reasons. One, the first one that I referred to a while ago, is that talking about the amount of light from one particular little patch is like judging the retinal images, which is not the right basis for judging it. But even more powerfully than that, I think, if this were a checkerboard, and there were that shape there which casts a shadow and so on, okay, so instead of this being a slide on the screen here, we could set it up. And you wouldn't call it an illusion that we judged the black square to be darker than the light square. We would say, no, that's correct perception, because that's actually what was there, okay? So it's another situation here where what you do in order to make it quotes an illusion is to reproduce, to make a facsimile of the patterns of light that would be produced by some other real-world situation. And the real-world situation we would not judge as being an illusion, so we shouldn't judge a photograph of it like this as being an illusion either. This is a fun one. This actually won first prize in the VSS Illusion of the Year competition a number of years ago. It's by a good friend of mine, Sugihara, in Japan. And I'm going to try, at the risk of this demonstration failing, it will do, won't it? Let me actually, in case you haven't seen it before, it's a lovely demonstration. Oh, here we go. Good, okay. Wait a minute. I want to go back to the beginning. Help. It's the Wi-Fi, you know. Come on, come on, come on. You'll get there in a second. Anyway, it's another example, as it comes up, I hope, of the view taken rather like an Ames room from one specific location, and you get the impression that these balls are actually traveling uphill. Aha, here we go. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Here we go, right. So what have we got here? A lot of upgoing slopes. Ah, my gosh, you see the balls are going uphill as they're defying gravity. Isn't this absolutely amazing? Okay, until you rotate the whole thing around like this and view the thing from a different location, and lo and behold, you find that, of course, it's down in a hollow. But from the one particular vantage point, it creates the same image as if those uphill ramps would do. And therefore, we think this is absolutely amazing, but in some sense, it's just a facsimile. In some sense, it has to be true. Okay, let me go back to the slides. There we go. And there are the two views of it there, what it really is and what it looks like from one particular position. So again, I don't regard that as being illusion. So what I would like to call facsimiles, you know, like the old-fashioned fax machines, things which are projectively equivalent, they actually present the same optic array to the eye, tell us nothing that we couldn't have learned from the real-world situations that they mimic, and therefore they're not illusions. Now, what is common to the real situation and the facsimile is the information that's provided. Take the stereoscope, for example. In order to create an impression of a structure standing out in depth in a stereoscope with flat pictures, you have to create the same disparities between the two pictures that would be created by a real-world object. So if information is the thing that's in common to the two situations, and it's the perspective information that's in common to rectangular rooms and to the Ames room. So you might think, therefore, a better definition of illusions is not where there's a departure from what's out there, but rather whether there's a departure from the information that's provided from out there. Because the information that's provided by the Ames room is that it's rectangular. The information provided by a stereoscope is that you've got a 3D object in depth. So maybe a better definition of an illusion is a situation where there's a discrepancy between what we perceive and the information that's provided. Because then, as I say, things like the Ames room would no longer be an illusion. So that sounds better, doesn't it? But how do we define this thing called information? It's one of the most misused terms, it seems to me, in the whole of psychology. We use it in cognition, we use it in perception and various other things, information, in various different ways. But how should we, in this context, define perceptual information? Well, according to David Marr, it's based on mathematics and geometry. And to give a couple of examples, if you think about optic flow, you know, the patterns of motion that are produced when we move through the world. Now, those have a particular mathematical, geometrical characteristics. And therefore, you can prove, as Christopher Longgett Higgins did, and Jan Kunderink and Ants van Doorn some years ago, you can prove that in that transforming optic array, that expanding optic array, there is information to tell you you're moving through the world, and indeed lots of other things. One of them that you might be familiar with is the so-called time to contact. So if I'm approaching my chairman at a constant speed, then the image of the chair is actually dilating on my retina, isn't it? And actually the 1 over, the reciprocal of the rate of dilation, tells me in how many seconds I'm going to hit you. So there's another example from mathematics and from geometry of how there is information there. And of course the claim is that birds, when they're flying down in to catch fish in the sea, use those rates of dilation. So information can be defined mathematically. That's what I think David Marr thought, and perhaps many of us have thought for many, many years. But in fact, that turns out not to be adequate. If you think about something like, if you think about what particular aspect is it of the rate of dilation that we're using, because there might be a rate of dilation, but what particular aspect are we using? And that's illustrated most vividly, I think, if you take something like perspective. As a throwaway line, I said, there's perspective information in this room telling you about its shape or the ceiling or in the Ames room. But what actually is the perspective information that we use? Is it the parallel nature of lines? Is it the texture gradients that are produced by, you know, a surface which is receding into the distance, the foreshortening gradients and so on? There are many different aspects of perspective. So when you say what is the information that allows you to judge the shape of the room or the shape of the Ames room, it's not obvious what it is that we actually use in terms of the perspective information. So in other words, instead of being a mathematical or geometrical issue, it becomes an empirical issue. What do we actually use? And that's what we've obviously been trying to do for years, to work out what it is in the perspective that we're using in order to judge the shapes of surfaces and the contours and so on. So in other words, the mathematics or the geometry perhaps only sets the boundary conditions, the limiting conditions, and doesn't specify what we actually use. So what I'm trying to get at is, how do we define this thing called an illusion? We've come to the conclusion so far that it's when there's a mismatch between the information available and what we see, but the information available isn't some abstract description, mathematical description of the world. It actually depends on how our particular perceptual systems work. Okay, so what's the consequence of that? Once we identify the source of information that we use, once we've defined how the system works, then of course there can't be any discrepancies, because that's how the system works, and therefore there can be no illusions. So that's the bottom line of why I don't believe there are any illusions, is because any description of that outside world in terms of the information available has to be more specified in more detail as to actually what it is that we use, and once you've specified what it is that we use, there can't be any discrepancies. It's just a description of how the system works. A good example would be trichromacy, our color vision. You know, we don't regard the fact that, you know, a mixture of red and green light together looks yellow, okay? We don't call that an illusion. We call it just a property of the trichromatic system, okay? And that's what I really want to argue, that once we've actually worked out how our visual systems work, then obviously there can't be any illusions, because there's no mismatch between how the system works and actually what we perceive. So, and think about it this way, that this concept of information is also species specific. It can't be a uniform description of the information. Take the fact that, for example, all of you, especially in this warm room, are glowing because it's so warm in here. And if I were a snake, I could actually detect where you are, because snakes are capable of detecting infrared radiation. So there's an example, you see, of the fact that this thing called information, where things are, has to be defined exactly with respect to the particular species. There's no general description of that information. And as I say, once you talk about a particular species and its particular system, then any description of the information is the same as the description of how the system works. They're two sides of the same coin, if you like. Okay, let me just make a couple of other points. What about the things that we typically regard as illusions and things that we don't? Well, I think this makes the point nice and clearly, because take thresholds, for example. Oh gosh, time's passed, hasn't it? Take thresholds, for example. If we reduce the amount of light of a small spot or something like that below a certain amount, then we can't see it anymore. That's a threshold, isn't it? But would you want to regard that spot of light, which is just too dim for us to see it, and therefore our perception doesn't match up with what is actually there, as an illusion? Of course we wouldn't. We just say, that's a threshold. That's a property of the visual system. Okay? Likewise, our failure to discriminate. Likewise, again, there's a difference between two shades of color, for example, which we can't tell the difference between, but there is a physical difference out there. That's not an illusion. That's just the way our color visual system works. Another example, nonlinearities. The fact that if you double the amount of light in a room, it doesn't look twice as bright. And that's because there's a logarithmic transform, isn't there, in the amount of light and the brightness that we perceive. Again, that's not an illusion. That's just how the system works. Okay, so all these things we wouldn't regard as illusions. Metamers. That's, I don't know whether you're familiar with this word, but this is the fact that if you mix red and green light together, you perceive yellow, and it's indistinguishable from a true yellow. Now, is that an illusion? No, it isn't. It's merely how our particular trichromatic visual system works. It's amazing how chauvinistic we are about our visual systems. Because don't we say, oh, those poor people are colorblind, they can't distinguish all the shades. Well, actually, we are colorblind. We are entirely limited by the fact that we only have 3 different sorts of receptors. And actually, if we were tetrachromatic or pentachromatic, then we would be able to see many more shades. So we're very chauvinistic. We can't imagine what it'd be like to have a perceptual system other than our own. And I think that's a rather nice point to make. But it certainly wouldn't regard it as an illusion. Q conflicts, I won't... assimilation. That's another obvious example where if you have a striped pattern, and I didn't deliberately put on a striped shirt, but if I go far enough away from you, you can't distinguish the stripes any longer. They're still there, but we obviously haven't got the visual acuity to be able to detect them. That's not an illusion. That's, again, just it's a low threshold for detecting the grating pattern. So, it says summary so far. You're going to get worried, aren't you? I'll stop after this, I think. The important points are that it seems to me that the actual technique for creating an optic array or a pair of optic arrays is totally irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether it's a 3D TV, whether it's a stereoscope or any other device. What they're all designed to do is to present the 2 eyes, for example, with exactly the same pattern of light as you would get when you view a normal scene. So in that sense, you see, it's the technique for creating that optic array is rather irrelevant. It's just a matter of convenience. If you think about the Ames room, Ames had to build that because he couldn't do the trick that I did, which was to take a square room and superimpose with Photoshop 2 different sized people. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have done that, wouldn't he? So it was just a matter of convenience that he used that particular technique. But it's not actually how the image is created, it's what information is available. So therefore, perhaps the only coherent definition of what constitutes an illusion is when there's a discrepancy between what we perceive and the available information. However, as I've already said, information can't be identified simply by considering the mathematics and the geometry of the situation. Rather, it has to be defined with respect to a particular species and a particular set of mechanisms. And of course, there are differences even within the same species, like trichromacy and dichromacy and so on. Since all our perceptions are a consequence of the way our sensory systems work, it doesn't make sense to identify some aspects as being illusory and others as being correct or veridical. And the final point, just to reassure anyone who's spent their lifetime, like me, working on the illusions, that doesn't mean that things we conventionally call illusions are not useful and relevant. They can be. Of course they can be, because they actually reveal to us something about how the system works. But nevertheless, it seems to me that there can be no strict dividing line, as I said right at the start, between the things that we regard as correct perceptions and the things that we regard as illusions. Thanks very much. No time for questions, it's lunchtime.
Да. Уважаемые коллеги, у нас очень мало времени, да, то есть на 2 вопроса, маленьких 2 вопроса и...
Yes.
Yes, 2 questions.
One will be mine. So then the question is the question like whether other species have illusions is relevant.
Yes.
It is irrelevant then. In your scheme.
Yes.
It's a useless question.
Yes, it is. I mean, yeah, people do investigate it, don't they? And
well, that's a different story,
yes.
Technically, but...
Yeah, and well, it's not irrelevant in the sense, as I said at the end, that actually we want to know how a particular animal visual system works, but it's irrelevant.
My question was in the first part of your talk.
Yes, yes.
Thanks a lot.
Hello.
I like how the system works standpoint, and the relevant question is why system works in this way. Is it the result of the system history? I mean, the results of our ontogenetic experience, or?
Yes. No, that's a very good question. And many of the things that I've talked about, I'm sure, are the result of innate mechanisms, trichromacy, etc. But obviously other aspects of perception are learned and get, I like that you use the Gibsonian phrase that, of course, we get a more attuned visual system. We learn to make discriminations that we couldn't do previously. But it raises a rather general point that we make this distinction between whether something or not is innate or whether it's learned. But it always seems to me, and Richard Gregory is very fond of this, I mean, in terms of, and it's an important empirical issue as to what young babies can and can't see. But of course, from my perspective, either there is something there that we can use or there isn't. And that something there could have been picked up over evolution, or it could be picked up during the individual's lifetime. And that obviously is an empirical question, but in some sense it's the same thing. It's not as if there's something miraculous about the evolution. Yes, yes, indeed, yeah. And of course I think that's why the study of comparative species is so important, because you see all the beautiful adjustments that different animals make to their particular environments. Fish with 9 different receptor types and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's a nice point.
Dr. Roджерс, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Мы должны заканчивать.